All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to ESMT. My name is Georg Garlichs. I'm the CFO here at ESMT, one of the managing directors. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you today to our first event of the new ESMT Insight Hour series. Now, building on the success of our open lectures, maybe some of you might have participated in some of them, this new series will provide a platform for meaningful conversations on current and pressing global issues. So to start with, today, we're honored to have with us Professor Michael Posner. Michael Posner, right? Well, a distinguished human rights lawyer, a former US State Department official under US President Barack Obama, and the director of the Center of Business and Human Rights at NYU Stern. Now, I must mention that your former boss was already with us, so a bit before you, so we're happy that you follow him. And now, a few years ago, we had a wonderful speech that Barack Obama gave here at ESMT. Yeah. Professor Posner will share insights from his latest book, Conscience Incorporated, which explores how business can balance the pursuit of profit with a commitment of protecting human rights. Leading today's discussions is Markus Löning, the founder and managing director of Löning Human Rights and Responsible Business. He will be joined by Anahita, who will share her expertise on corporate responsibility, drawing on her role as a head of Baker McKenzie's International Trade Practice Group in Germany. I would also like to extend a warm welcome to those joining us online. We look forward to a very interesting discussion, I believe, on a very interesting and very important topic. Now, we agreed that Markus is going to introduce our two other panelists, and then Michael is going to lead us a bit into the topic, and then we will have a discussion, and you will all have a chance to participate in that discussion. So thanks for coming. The floor is yours.
The thank goes out to him or me. Oh, okay. I'll use this one. Can you now also hear me online? Nobody says anything, so I guess they do. Okay, great. So first of all, thanks a lot to ESMT and the team for welcoming us and for hosting this event. And of course, it's a special honor to be like the first Insight Hour. We'll hope to do our best and give it a great kickoff here. And I'm very happy to have a discussion with Mike and with Anahita. I've known both of them from my work when I was the Human Rights Commissioner of the federal German government. And maybe to introduce myself to those of you that do not know me, I've had a career in politics. I've been a member of the German parliament, mainly busy with foreign policy, European affairs, development policy, traveling to many, many countries, and also meeting a lot of people in business, in different places of business. And then I became the German Federal Human Rights Commissioner at the time when the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights were adopted. And that actually sparked the idea to create a management consultancy which would help companies work on these topics. Because there's NGOs on one side and there's academia on the other side, and businesses somewhere in between. And some of the businesses I met and said, we don't really know how to move forward on this topic. So that was the idea to say, okay, we'll create a management consultancy. I'm very happy to see some of my colleagues around here, and happy to share some practical insights. Let me say a few words about Mike, if I may. He has been introduced, but our relations dates back to the time when he was my counterpart in the US administration. We did a lot of exchange on issues like, what did the Chinese actually tell you in your human rights dialogue? What were the cases they didn't want to address? What were the excuses and the tactics they were using? And I specifically remember when we were talking about the fall of the military government in Myanmar, and how we were aligning, saying, okay, what kind of pressure can we put on them so that they first release the political prisoners before we go back on the sanctions. And ever since we've been in touch, and as you know, things happen, we're in the same field still, in a way. So very happy to have you here, Mike, and looking forward to our discussion. And I've known Anahita also from human rights, and Anahita has always impressed me because she was one of the corporate lawyers I've known that always addressed human rights issues, that addressed corporate responsibility. You have been engaged in fighting forced labor, slave labor. We both are on the board of UNICEF fighting for children's rights. So it's not very often that you meet a corporate lawyer that is so committed to human rights and makes that public all the time, speaks, and at the same time brings in the perspective from the work with corporate clients. So I'm very happy that you're both here, and I'm looking forward to having a great discussion. And obviously, it will be about Mike's book, but I would say the obvious elephant in the room is also what's happening in the US. So, Mike, maybe you can start by introducing your book, and then if you both want to sit.
So first of all, I want to thank you, ESMT, for hosting, and Markus for that lovely introduction. Okay. And I'm delighted to be here, really honored to be here. I'll just say a couple words by way of introduction, and then I really do want us to have a conversation. I wrote this book called Conscious Incorporated that reflects on what I've been doing the last 12 years at New York University Business School, where we started a colleague and I started a center on business and human rights. And it's the first business school really in the world that has had a human rights center. We're now about 10 people. One of my great colleagues is here somewhere, Dorothy Baumann-Pauly, who's created a second center at the University of Geneva Management School. And what we're trying to do, just three quick thoughts about the book and what we're trying to do. The book reflects a range of things we've been trying to do over the last decade, last 12 years. One is to start from the proposition that the greatest achievement in human rights over the last 50 years is the reduction of global poverty. In 1980, there were 2 billion people living below the level the World Bank calls extreme poverty. 77% of people living in East Asia were living in extreme poverty in 1980. That's now been not eradicated, but there's been an unbelievable progress made. People going from rural to urban, from farming to factories and service jobs. And it's largely a China story. So that's the headline for me. We ought to, and it's not just the development agencies of various governments. It's not the UN or the World Bank, UNDP. It's jobs. It's about the globalization of our economy. And so I start
Professor, I'm going to have to interrupt you. I'm sorry, but can you put the microphone a little bit closer? People online are having a problem.
Is that better? Okay. Sorry about that. So I start from a positive sense that business has been a driver of the reduction of poverty. It's a globalized economy. Big corporations in Germany or the United States have taken advantage of open communications, more transportation, and created these job opportunities. Second point, and this is really what the book focuses on. We live in a world where a majority of people live in countries where their own governments are not protecting them. They're not doing their job. Vast majority of people live in a country where either the government's unwilling or unable to actually protect their people. The assumption of the UN when it was created, all of the international standards of the last 80 years, assumes that every government's going to be responsible. We don't live in that world. And so there's a governance gap. And so you get big companies from the West going into developing countries in the global south, and there really aren't rules. They're kind of there in a state that's been undefined. There aren't rules of the road for this new global economy. So part of what Markus is doing, part of what I'm doing, part of what Anahita is doing, are trying to figure out what does it mean to have rules of the road in a globalized 21st century economy. And then the third bit, which is sort of really where we focus, whether we're looking at global supply chains for manufacturing, or we're looking at mining, or we're looking at the tech sector, we need to begin to think about what's the relationship between these big global companies, their business partners, suppliers, whoever their business partners are, and government. And here, the European governments, Germany and others, have taken a lead in saying governments need to be part of this equation. Companies are never going to do all that they need to do without being pushed. And on the other hand, governments alone can't make it happen. So our conversation today is really about, and the point of the book is, how do we find some practical ways to guide governments and to guide companies that are willing to think about building those rules of the road so that basic human rights extend beyond our Western societies to the rest of the world, where so many big global companies are making their profit. Last comment on the elephant in the room. I am a diehard optimist. I'm coming from a country that's in chaos right now, where we have all kinds of challenges posed by a government that is not beholden to human rights or the rule of law. We're challenged in many, many ways, but we're not going to give up. And part of my message today to you, to everybody here and in Europe, is we need partners, supporters outside of the United States to reinforce the notion that for the sake of business, for the sake of society, for the sake of everyone, we need to hold on to the values of democratic societies rooted in rule of law, human rights, stability, predictability. Unfortunately, our government's going the other way. We're going to defeat that, but it's going to be a struggle. Lots of people are going to get hurt. We will be stronger if collectively we can figure out what's the right combination of internal pressure from within the United States and big, strong countries like Germany and big, strong partners like industry helping us to fight that battle. Let me stop with that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mike. Now let me turn to you, Anahita. You're also board member of Atlantikbrücke, which is an organization that was founded in the early 50s to strengthen relationships between Germany, Europe, and Canada and the US mainly at all levels. And I looked up in the internet what Atlantikbrücke says about themselves, and they said, well, the founding principles were actually to anchor Germany in Western institutions and in the partnership with North America for a strong democracy, global stability, and economic growth. Now you could maybe add rule of law. But now I'm wondering, what's your view if you look at US administration that is attacking all of these pillars of a free society at the moment? What does that mean for the relations between Germany, Europe in general, and the US?
Obviously, it's very challenging at the moment, but I refuse to focus only on the big picture, because if we just look at the big picture, it's very easy for us to give up. It's very easy for us to also claim we cannot do anything. So I would really focus on what you can do as individuals, what you can then take it up another level, say, what can I do in my community? And then what can I do within my company or institution? This is the only way forward in my view, because otherwise I see so many people not being willing to discuss openly and not being willing to be part of the discussion. And I think this is the biggest challenge, that some people see themselves either as being left out, worried not to be able to voice their opinion, or even worse, worried of losing their jobs. So I do believe that if we stand by those with integrity, they will lose those fears. If we give them opportunities to come to our organizations, to work with us, I think that's what I would say. And I think also when you work in the transatlantic space, it's a long-term game. I would always look at it as from the perspective of, I don't work on transatlantic relations because of one government. I work for transatlantic relations because I believe in the foundation and why actually the Atlantic Booker was founded. And it gives me hope that in that period of time, we were able to bridge some challenging discussions, and it's going to be a continued challenge. And it's also important to know that some difficult discussions take place right now, but let's see what happens in 4, 8, or 12 years. So it's a long-term game.
Thank you. So it's a good start that hearing from both of you a more optimistic view and the way forward. Maybe I can extend that question to focus a bit on business, because Trump is one of the uncertainties we're confronted with at the moment. The other one is that we do not have a German government at the moment, and we didn't have one for 5 months now. I looked it up, and there's not going to be a government for another 4 weeks, probably. Well, we're not Belgium, but we can somehow deal with this. We can live with it, but it does spread a sort of incertitude among business. When I'm talking to businesses, this is, it's not a good situation. And then on top, to focus on our topic of business and human rights and corporate responsibility, we see that the whole legislation that has just been passed in a very painful process through European Parliament, through the European Council, and you can always debate them, but there is a direction, there was clarity, and now it's being questioned again. So all of this adds up to this uncertainty. And my question to you would be, to you, Anahita, would be, how can companies find their way forward in this uncertainty, especially if you're thinking about the business and human rights and other sustainability regulation? And then we'll turn to Mike after that and ask him what the American view is on that.
So I was just at the OECD talking about anti-bribery and corruption. And we came to the conclusion that uncertainty is the new normal. Don't want to take away any of the optimism here, but in that regard, I would say that companies will, or some of them are already used to, and some of them have to get used to the challenges that we face, and it is fast moving in one or the other direction. What I definitely recommend companies to be aware of more is, I wrote an article about the supervisory boards and that they should have more geopolitical understanding. I remember when I published that article, people were like, come on, we have so many requirements. There's so many things that we need to know. And now you're starting with geopolitical understanding. Seriously? Few years in, I think no one is questioning that some of the knowledge has been lacking significantly. Your governmental affairs team needs to understand what's going on in Brussels. I very often see that some people don't understand what's happening in Brussels. They don't have their foot in the door when it comes to legislation. They don't have context beneath the top government people in the US, for example. So I would definitely recommend that companies rethink that if they have not already done so, to build on their knowledge and their network when it comes to having a clear understanding where are we going to, although we all don't know. And I agree with you, 5 months without a German government is tough. At the same time, I do believe what we really want to avoid is another 4 years of fighting against each other. So I'd rather have another 4 weeks of proper negotiations and then at least 3 years of quietness, hopefully, but maybe that part is too over-optimistic.
Let's do some expectation management from the government. Now, Mike, if I'm asking the similar question to you, so the US situation is also not adding clarity. I mean, we see the pushback on ESG investment. It seems to me, it seems like a cultural war taking place. So that's like big pushback on ESG investment on the one side. Then on the other side, you see that the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act was actually initiated by the now foreign minister. So it's like, where are we heading? Where is that going? Is it moving forward? The sustainability agenda is only the forced labor agenda moving forward because of its usefulness regarding China, or is there a genuine, let's say, commitment behind it to say we need to protect people's rights?
Yeah, I don't think there's a logical explanation for almost anything that's going on. But what I would say is the divide between the U.S. and the EU is greater than it's been for decades, forever. And as Europe is at least struggling with how to create some regulations in this space, the U.S. is going exactly the opposite way. There's one of the architects of sort of the Silicon Valley tech bros is a guy named Peter Thiel, and he wrote an article some years ago, and he said, we have a choice between freedom and democracy. Freedom meaning innovation where the government completely stays out of the way and we advance technically and we lead the world, or you can have all these democratic norms. I'm fighting for democracy, and I think there is actually a way you can be both democratic and free. But the guiding principle for the US administration now is let's reduce government, let's hollow it out, and let's just create as much business opportunity as we can by freeing companies from the constraints. And there's no doubt, you know, I worked in an administration, a Democratic administration, where we were very focused on government regulations, safety for airplanes, and workplace safety and slave labor. And there are moments at which that goes too far. So companies are right to say there's too many reporting requirements, it's too bureaucratic. But the current administration goes way too far in the other direction. Let's throw the whole thing out. So I agree with the notion we need to take a longer term view. These people are not going to be around forever. We need to limit the damage, and they are doing lots of damage to the most vulnerable people in our world. But we also need to be thinking about what comes next and how we build stronger models for what ought to be, again, the right relationship between government and the private sector. One last thing on the private sector. I'm saying a lot to American companies. You've thrived, certainly in the post-war years, in a world where international institutions have been created that promote the rule of law, that promote development, that create stability, that create a sense of you can do business and compete and succeed. All of that is now being challenged, and too many companies, I think, are nervous about what's going on, but they're not sufficiently organized among themselves in a way that's challenging things that are actually not in their best interest. Anahita mentioned the foreign corruption. We've had a law in the books in the United States since 1977 called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. It was created by the government at the request of companies who said, we're paying too many bribes to foreign officials. We need a law that says we're not allowed to do that. One of the taking apart of the system by the Trump administration is to say, let's pause that law. We don't need that. It's anti-competitive. No, it's actually a business-friendly law. We need to be making that case, and businesses need to be making that case to the administration.
No, my next question was going to go in that direction exactly. So is there, thinking of a, let's say, European company that has a lot of business in the US. Now, if we assume there is a business case for being decent, for respecting human rights in your supply chains, what does that mean for business with the US in the future? You have laws, and that there will be laws in place in the EU. They're going to stay. The core of it is, that's my prediction, is going to stay. But and then there's, let's say, pushback on the US and saying, if you have DI somewhere on your website, you're not going to do business. And how can companies deal with that dilemma?
Well, yeah. So this is one of the crazy things going on. The administration and people in the world of Trump and Musk have taken the view that the word diversity is a four-letter word. You can't use the word diversity. You can't believe in diversity. And they've made it really difficult for companies or universities or government to even think about diversity. What does diversity mean? What it means to me is you want to give everyone the opportunity to compete and to succeed. You want the best people to have an opportunity to have a fair shot at succeeding, whether it's in business or government or university. It doesn't mean that every DEI program was well managed or achieved that goal. And so I think part of what we need to do and businesses need to do is think about what's the value underlying diversity. It means there ought to be more opportunities for women, for underrepresented minorities, whatever, to compete and succeed. It doesn't mean that you have to have a quota or an affirmative action plan that says X%. We need to rethink that. We need to be honest about the fact that this is an area where we need to do better. But throwing the concept out makes no sense. And I would say to any company that is trying to figure out how to be successful commercially and socially, you want your company to reflect the society in which it operates. And you benefit from that. You get diverse points of view. You wind up being commercially successful, but it takes doing. You have to be conscious of where the opportunities being lost by not providing that opportunity for people to compete and succeed.
So as a corporate lawyer focusing on international affairs, I can tell you that we have dilemmas and conflicts of laws in other areas already. So to give you a concrete example, for example, there are sanctions by the United States against Cuba forever, and there is an anti-boycott law in place in the European Union and by Germany forever. So these are things that we have had to handle for a very long time already. So it is not that we never had the situation. So even with the US, our close ally, we had differences and global companies had to deal with them. Is it easy? No, especially because, as you know, our German companies are very international. Their supply chains are super complex. Their interrelatedness with the US market is significant. So companies will struggle. And but again, I do believe that you can basically manage it. Would it be better otherwise? Yes. And I think what Mike said in the very beginning is how many people actually benefited from trade and collaboration in the last few decades, particularly in Germany and the United States. I think that is something that we don't reiterate enough, and we should be reiterating that a lot going forward, because the US has also benefited a lot, and we will see that this topic will be discussed in many more institutions, universities going forward, because I'm convinced that many people who have experienced how many people we took out of poverty, but also in those wealthy countries, how lives have changed for the better. I want to highlight one thing. When you look at the US tariffs, when it comes to steel and aluminum, many companies may say, well, it doesn't affect me, but how much of that product is actually incorporated in other products like medtech, products that really are needed for everyone, and we know that the cost, the health costs will go up. So every move when it comes to restricting trade has collateral damages. And we need to, the academia, the practitioners, the politicians, the policymakers, but also the youth, you know. I always call upon the young people to say, okay, you have a voice, make sure that it is heard based on facts, not emotionally presented, but just, you know, what are the facts, what are the numbers, and who actually has benefited a lot. And looking at the productivity rates of the United States, you can really tell who has really benefited a lot from globalization in the last few decades and in the last few years.
Now, you've both been, you both addressed the issue that you said, Mike, that you as Americans would need support from the outside, from countries, but also from businesses. Anahita, you've just rightly addressed that, you know, how much businesses have profited from DEI programs, from changing, even though it's slow, it takes time, it's frustrating a lot of times, but still, I personally do see some progress in that. And I see that it helps companies. But what does that mean for the role of companies in this situation in the US? Are they there to speak up publicly, which is something that has been one of the public demands more strongly over the last years, that companies speak up publicly for their values, for the values they claim they stand for. In what kind of situation does it bring them? Is it realistic to ask for that? Will they do that? Or could they possibly do that?
So I have a chapter in the book about exactly this, and I take a quite conservative view. There's been a lot of pressure on corporate leaders to speak out about reproductive rights or LGBT issues or gun control, range of social issues that are topical. And it's a tricky business, because if you're running a big company, you have employees that are on all sides of those issues. And so what I counsel in the book is, don't just jump in on every issue of the day. But there's one big exception, which is if there are actions taking place that undermine fundamentally democracy and democratic protections, then you have an obligation to do it. And I was not talking about Trump. He hadn't been elected when I wrote this. I was focusing on restrictions on the right to vote in the United States, state of Georgia. And there was a group of business leaders that came together, former head of American Express, Ken Chenault, Ken Fraser from Merck. A group of business leaders said people ought to have the right to vote. Now we're facing a much broader challenge to democratic norms. And I think American companies need to be finding ways to find their voice. They can do it privately in some ways publicly, but they have to do it together. There's I think I understand the reluctance of a corporate CEO to stand up and denounce what's going on. Trump is a bully. You don't want to be the one singled out. And so one of the things I'm trying to counsel companies is get together, figure out what does this mean for business, and try to find ways through the Business Roundtable or Chamber of Commerce, try to find ways to have a collective voice that say, some of these things are not in our interest. And I'm saying, take a look at things that haven't happened yet. We're going to have a case somewhere in the next 2 or 3 months where the U.S. Supreme Court is going to issue a ruling, and it is just possible that the administration is going to say, we don't accept that ruling, we're going to ignore it. That will be a constitutional crisis, a democratic crisis for the United States. And I certainly hope that there will be business leaders who will say, whoa, we also benefit from independent courts. We have a president now that is saying maybe he can take a third term. If our elections are disrupted in a way that violates the Constitution, we need businesses to say, wait a second, this goes too far. We love the tax cuts. We like the deregulation. We want to do business with the U.S. government, but we have a more fundamental interest here, which is preserving the foundation which has made us successful.
I'd like, after there have been attacks on companies, but also on law firms. So what does it mean, Anahita, for law firms that work on both sides of the Atlantic? What does it mean for companies that work on both sides of the Atlantic? You know, putting up the flag of social responsibility, of climate responsibility when their home is Europe, but then also obviously need to do part of the business of the US, because for many companies it's a large chunk of the business. They cannot simply say, we're going to shut this down. Do you expect business leaders, but also in that case, looking at law firms, for example, to step up publicly and speak publicly, address these topics publicly?
I have actually also written about the topic of speaking up by business leaders in Germany, a focus on Germany, because I have observed very different ways of doing it in the past. And my take was actually very similar, which is we don't want CEOs to comment on every little current thing that is going on in the press. They are subject to very concrete rules if they are, a stock corporation, for example. But when it comes to the fundamentals, and what I described in the article was when it comes to human rights and democracy and the rule of law, that's the foundation of everything that we do. And that's actually the foundation of every transaction the companies do. If you talk to the companies, they will always tell you we need security, we need legal certainty. So, but that's about it. That I know if the court makes a decision, it's based on the fundamentals. So I would definitely say we do need more business leaders to voice their concerns, but put it in a more positive way. What do I mean with that? I know many people, and there are 3 team members from me here today. People apply to be with us because they say you stand for something. You stand for principles. We want to work for you personally. And this is a positive sign. And if you get the best resumes in Germany because of that, it's actually worth money. So every business leader who thinks I cannot voice my principles, I would say I do believe that there is proof of concept that you can. This being said, I'm very careful of judging business leaders in other countries. Very careful to do that, because I hear that so often, especially when it comes to countries where we know there is no democracy. There is basically no rule of law. And it's very easy for us to sit here in Germany and say, they didn't voice their concerns, they didn't go on the streets, they didn't demonstrate. I would never, ever dare to judge people who would be subject to torture, their family may be subject to torture, or even they may lose their jobs, although they have a mortgage, they have 3 children they need to feed. So let's all be very careful when we judge people in different countries where we don't know the circumstances, or even in our own country where we don't know what is the background. Maybe actually they are taking care of their people internally much better than that CEO who's just voicing it to get a platform.
Thank you. Sorry. I would open the floor now to questions if we have another quarter of an hour or so. Any questions there? Yes, please. Could you maybe just say your name and please use the microphone.
Hello, thank you first of all. My name is Katharina Hock. I work for Mercedes-Benz on ESG and sustainability topics. My question is about recent development. So a few days ago, some of the big Swiss corporates, they announced they would be rolling back their diversity and inclusion programs. So I think it was Roche, Novartis, and UBS. And for me, I was actually a bit shocked, to be honest, because I think it's sending out a terrible signal, especially to prospective employees of these companies, right? To young people. I was wondering, do you see that happening more now in European countries, that a lot of corporates will be doing that? I can just say from our company, there's no idea at the moment to do that. Hopefully that stays that way. But of course, in the US, our communication on these issues at the moment, we are really looking to, be careful on that topic, of course. But just completely getting rid of all the diversity and inclusion programs globally, I think this is really a really big step, and I don't see any good coming out of that, right, for companies. So what's your assessment on that? Do you see that happening more also in Europe?
So let me we'll both talk to. So one thing that I've seen that is encouraging to me is that there are some, even in the US, there's some big companies, Microsoft, Apple, Costco, that have said, our business, we've made a business judgment that having diverse workforce and to have equity and to have opportunity for everybody is in our business interest. We're going to keep doing it. Those are big companies, especially Apple and Microsoft. They can afford, in a way, to challenge. A lot of other companies are saying, oh my God, we have to get rid of this. And what I've said to companies is, I don't care what you call it. Keep doing it. Keep doing what you know is right. If you need to change the words on your website, I don't care about that. I care about what you're instructing your human resources department to do, what your managers are being. Are you still nurturing people, giving them mentoring, supporting them, making sure that actually people do have a chance to compete and succeed? So if the value is the same, keep doing it and try to navigate this kind of insane world where, you know, the United States government has put out a list of like 20 words you're not allowed to say. That's just, you know, it's a farce. It's not serious. And you should be aware that those 20 words you're not supposed to say, but don't stop what you're doing if you know it's right.
If you look at we have focused a lot on the US right now, but I would like to take the lens of the international community for a second, if I may, because there are so many countries where we see navigating human rights, but also something that goes also beyond that, like standing with dignity and integrity when you do business. It has never been easy, and I think to look back and see where we're coming from. You know, when I started to fight for children in the supply chain, and we've been doing some of the work together. People did not really understand what we were talking about, child labor in the supply chain. Speaking with German parliamentarians and state secretaries, it's been mind-blowing how little people knew, and there was basically no awareness whatsoever, not because they couldn't have known, right? But they either didn't care or it wasn't on top of their agenda. So let's a little bit also look at where we're coming from and what we have achieved along the way, because really 10 years ago, that's not too long ago, there was no awareness whatsoever on the responsibilities that we can have, let's put it positively, we don't have, but we can have, if we work together with the nonprofits on the ground, what we can do together to make the lives of the people, especially the children, a little bit better. So I think, again, everything that I do in my engagement against child labor, I look at it long term. And at the same time, I look at it one child at a time. So if we have changed the lives of one child, of children of one community, that's a success. Will we change the whole world? Let's not be naive. But also, let's not claim that we cannot do anything for the children, because that's a very easy way out.
Can I just jump in on that for 1 second? Markus, you and I were talking as we were walking over here about how much time and energy it takes to change the culture of a company. And one of the things that I started working in this field in the 1990s, and companies would routinely say, we follow local law. And now that is not, you don't hear that, or if you hear it, you know the company hasn't really begun even to think about these issues. Because again, we live in a globalized economy, and companies are making money by outsourcing whatever it is. They're outsourcing responsibility, and so now we've said, European regulators are beginning to say it won't be a linear process. No, there are going to be some rules. And it starts out with the notion of due diligence. I want to take it a step further. I think as you would in a national system, you have to have rules, you have to have standards, you have to have metrics, you have to evaluate performance. Every industry is different. So I think over the next 10 years, there's going to be a push and pull, but we're moving in the direction of saying whether you're in manufacturing or mining, or you're in the tech sector, you're building cars, there are standards that apply to our industry, and we're going to have to figure out with our competitors, how do we abide by those standards, and we're going to be judged by our performance. Have we made workers' lives better by what we're doing? That's where we're heading. It's a long road. We have to be mindful of all the obstacles, but I think if we're clear about where we're heading, then it becomes much easier to sort of set the path for how to get there.
Thank you. More questions? Yeah. I'll start here and then Christian.
Hi, my name's Simon Hicks. I'm a student here, and I'm also building a company which helps companies essentially understand the gaps in their due diligence processes and ask their suppliers to basically fulfill that information. So this is super relevant. I'm really interested in the incentives for companies to actually discover more about their, the fabric of their supply chains. It's usually the less I know, the better, which is, because the more you know, the more potential disruptions you might uncover and the more potential costs that you might have to, it's that whole kind of point about the outsourcing of responsibility, right? So what's your response to that? How do we kind of overcome that fundamental challenge, especially when the higher tiers of governance are essentially dissuading companies from doing that?
Yeah.
Mike? Christian von Mitzlaff, human rights practitioner with Live Standards. I have a question, how far this topic on Science Incorporated really goes. And where would you foresee a point of deterioration of business environment in countries with a vulnerable or weak governance, even autocratic countries, when doing business doesn't make really sense anymore? And would you see a coalition of corporates to stabilize human rights on those markets or these countries, even if this would not be in their own company interest, individual company interest? So for US, it's a big broad, but I'm also thinking about Africa or countries where we see the destabilization situation going further and further.
So in a way, the two questions go together. The subtitle of my book is Pursuing Profits While Protecting Human Rights. I don't say maximizing profits in the next 3 months. The bane of my existence is Milton Friedman, who 50 years ago said the only thing companies should worry about is maximizing shareholder returns, and that's been internalized by a lot of investors as in the next quarter, in the next 3 months. I think companies can be profitable, they can be successful, they can make profits, but they have to recognize that there's a cost, a financial cost to doing the right thing. We need to take a longer term view. When I talk to companies, I say, I can make the case, the business case, in 10 years, you're going to be a more sustainable, better company, but you're not going to, I can't do it in 3 months. I can't give you the formula. And so I think this is part of what needs to change in the way, and unfortunately, this is not just Trump, this is Wall Street. My school is 2 miles from Wall Street, and they drive this mentality. We have to maximize profits. Anything that's not that is an externality, environment, human rights. No, these are central business issues, and businesses need to invest to get it right. I want to come back to your question as well. I think it's also true that a lot of companies will see a difficult place, and rather than staying and trying to be part of the solution, they leave. I think that's a mistake. Disney, when the Rana Plaza collapsed in Bangladesh, they announced very publicly, Walt Disney, we're leaving Bangladesh. We don't like what's going on there. I wrote an article in the New York Times and said, shame on you, you should stay. You should be part of the solution. It may again mean that you're not going to maximize your returns. You're going to be dealing with a difficult place. But businesses that are there involved in trying to figure out what's right can actually reinforce human rights and democracy. So it's part of the same equation. Businesses should make a profit, but they also have a responsibility to be good citizens of the world. And sometimes that means, it often means, that they've got to make investments in doing what's right.
Sure. If you look at the supply chain mapping, you can see that before COVID hit, or when the Panama Canal was blocked, how little actually many of the global companies were prepared for that. It was astonishing to see, and I have to say that we have clients with 60,000, and that's not an exaggerated number of suppliers. Of course, they are tier 8, 9, 12, or whatever, but they are the suppliers, they're indirect ones. So it is difficult to do the supply chain mapping. So I would say the first business case for looking into it actually is to understand who you work with. And what we have also seen is you will not be able to change your suppliers easily. Let's say COVID hits or the Panama Canal is blocked. It's not like all the suppliers who have been waiting for you to come along. So I think there is a very clear business case for doing the supply chain mapping. The real question is, what's the second step? Is it so that you will accept that the margin that you make will be lower? That is, I do see that with companies, and with some they decide not to do so. So that's, I think, the realistic perspective of what we're seeing.
Thank you. Yeah, there's more questions. So there. You turn on the mic, please.
So you talked a lot about human rights.
full-time father. You talked a lot about human rights, mentioned LGBT, slave labor, child labor. I have more prosaic understanding of human rights that I want to define first before asking this question. So to me, human rights is the ability to find work, to give education to children, to have worked in healthcare for me and my children and my family, for example. And it's hard to get these human rights when you are dead or when you don't have time, when you are working 16 hours a day. And historically, people have worked 16 hours a day, not because businessmen were bad people 200 years ago, but because essentially they were saying, if we will not exploit our workers hard enough, somebody else will, and we will go bankrupt. States have more or less fixed this. They have issued laws so that you can't work more than 12 hours a day, than 10 hours a day, and eventually 8 hours a day. But then the competition on the market has led to companies growing bigger and bigger, to creation of monopolies, financial capital, which has grown into states, and these states has started to represent the interest of these big businesses, big monopolies, and support them, including performing military operations in order to protect the interests of these monopolies. And if you,
could you please, could you ask a question?
Yes, and now the question. So if so these wars, they essentially violate human rights. So people who invade countries die and people of the invaded countries die. How do we avoid wars so that we like enforce human rights and the ability to exploit them? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. This is the really big question. This is the, I understand the question of what influence in general should companies take on politics in general, I would say. So we have 2-3 more minutes, so maybe each of you can try to give a brief answer to a long question.
Yeah, it's a big question. So if you sort of go back to what the international standards are, the international human rights standards, there is a covenant, a treaty on civil and political rights. We're talking about free speech, elections, freedom, freedom of assembly, due process. And then there's a second treaty on economic and social rights. That's primarily been viewed as a government responsibility, but it's also true, as you're saying, and this is, we could spend another hour on this, that there is a growing gap between rich and poor. And that's partly what's pushing this polarization in our societies and the appeal of the kind of right-wing ideology. There's a, there are a lot of people who've been left behind. And so we have, this is more than a human rights question, but we need to figure out ways to give everyone an opportunity to make sure there's a safety net and to make sure that we don't just have the very rich benefiting from the economic system that we've set up. We have a lot of work to do on that in the United States. It's part of what brought Trump to office, but it's a larger question than I get to in my book, I must say.
You asked a big picture question, so I'll give a big picture answer. Very often when I sit with business leaders, they say, well, the UN did this, or the EU did this. The UN, it's the member states. The EU, it's the member states. And very often when I sit with political leaders, they say the companies, they don't do anything. And the companies, it's the individuals working for the companies. So I would reiterate the personal responsibility of each human being in what they can do. And again, don't judge those who cannot do much, but if you have a voice, use it wisely.
Thank you very much. I think these were wonderful closing words. So thanks a lot to all of you that came here, attended the discussion, and thank you very much to ESMT, but very much especially to Mike and to Anahita for your thoughtful ideas, for your deliberations, input you gave her. I think I'm taking home some ideas to think about, and I would go home slightly more optimistic than I came here. So that's, thank you very much. Thank you very much.